This is the Garis book readings of my two published paper books, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris@wordpress.com. This is chapter 2 of my book Multis and Monos. What the multicultured can teach the monocultured towards the creation of a global state. This is chapter 2, part 7. Continuing on the cons of Japan. In my view, Japan's inability to reform its educational policies is symptomatic of the weaknesses of Japan's whole culture, that is, its lack of grassroots democracy, that is, its passive, obedient population, which doesn't pressure politicians collectively to change the situation. The impotence of the politicians themselves, who are intellectually an inferior breed compared to the bureaucrats, and the lack of imagination and international experience of the bureaucrats themselves, the real power holders. What does Japan need to do to overcome its education problems and to reform and to return the fun to children's lives? There are a lot of things it could do, but it would involve a social revolution of Japan's whole social structure. I personally would like to see what I call a social Meiji. The Meiji era in Japan, starting more than a century ago, saw Japan very frightened of being colonized by us, the Westerners, the way we were doing to China, Africa, and other third world countries. To fight fire with fire, the Japanese quickly mobilized their energies to send young men to the West to bring back European scientific and technological knowledge in order to create a modern Japan with a strong military, with modern guns and ships, etc., capable of matching the West and preserving Japan's social values from the ideological onslaught of a European colonization of Japan. The Japanese had already had a taste of European ideological force with the rise of Japanese Catholicism in the 17th century, until it became threatening to the dictatorial power of the shoguns, the Japanese military dictators, who murdered 1 million Japanese Catholics to rid the country of their influence, and then closed the country to foreigners and to returning Japanese under pain of death. The Japanese underwent this technological Meiji transformation in a few decades, and even won a war against a major Western power, that is, against the Russians in 1905. The result is that Japan is now a modern nation, even one of the leaders, technologically speaking. However, I believe that Japan has now entered a new era of crisis in which another major social transformation is necessary, as it learns that in an information-based world economy, creativity is vital for survival. Japan's current social and economic institutions were set up after World War II to fuel an assembly line production-based economy, which are no longer suitable for the modern era. A social Meiji is needed, where the best social ideas from around the world are brought to Japan to modernize Japanese social institutions so that it can be proud of itself and earn the respect of the West. At the moment, I think it's fair to say that the West respects Japan's economic prowess but looks down on Japan's social inferiorities. To overcome the examination hell phenomenon, I would install a grade system at the universities, similar to those in the West. Employers would then know that a graduate with a high grade is smarter than another with a low grade. Which university the student went to would then be less relevant, so long as the grade standards were fairly uniform over the country. Employers could be guided by the grades rather than the names of the universities. In the present Japanese system, companies select people who have good memories and persistence, but not necessarily good creativity or analytic skills or ability to think critically. In fact, my general impression of the level of development of logical, critical thinking amongst Japanese is negative. The Japanese prefer to emphasize good feelings between people rather than to promote critical, logical dialogues. Logical thinking in Japan is not nurtured, with the result that the illogicality and inconsistency of the Japanese can infuriate Westerners who are educated as a basic Western value to think and express themselves clearly and logically. Japan should also set up an American-style GRE, Graduate Record Exam, which gives a nationally standardized IQ-type test to graduates who want to go on to do postgraduate work. Universities can then select their graduate school candidates partially on the basis of the GRE scores. In Japan, as in any modern country, the top jobs should go to the candidates who are selected at postgraduate level, not at high school level. The academically pressured years should be at postgraduate level. High schools know nothing and are usually too immature to know what they want to do in life. Japanese society needs to become more grassroots democratic and put effective collective pressure on its politicians so that companies do not dictate employment policy. Then it would be easier for employees to change companies so that getting into a given company, depending upon an entrance exam result at 18 years of age, becomes irrelevant. At the moment in Japan, the university years are seen as the only time to relax, sandwiched as they are between the examination hell of high school and the workaholic monodimensional pressure of company life. This system is sick and twisted and all wrong. It should be the other way round. The toughest years should be at university graduate level, in which the top minds are selected to occupy the top posts. Universities should be places of hard work, used to filter the brilliant from the good. Japanese universities today are rather low-status institutions compared to those in the West. Japan has won a pitiful 5 Nobel Prizes. This is in 97, remember. Japanese universities are seen by the West as being financially poor, with low salaries, as relatively stifling, with godlike professors who take authoritarian attitudes towards their students and staff, as having a rigid communication between departments and groups, and as being rather corrupt, with partisan selection of research projects and funding. Japanese universities are in a bad way and desperately need to be reformed and upgraded. This is starting now, but a lot needs to be done. To enable Japanese men to change their companies and careers more easily, Japanese women need to get off their bums and pursue careers. The women can then support the men financially, while the men change companies or careers, go back to university, etc., to get new qualifications. With men thus freed from their financial cages, they will want to change companies in larger numbers. As young men see that it's possible for them to change companies relatively easily, as in the West, this will reduce pressure on them to select the correct company for themselves at the beginning of their careers. With the reforms I'm suggesting here, just which university one gets into becomes less important. What is important is the grade one gets at graduate or postgraduate levels, and for the top jobs, how brilliantly one performs at PhD level. The very top jobs require people with brilliance, creativity and vision. Doing research encourages people to think in this way. Putting a person who scored well in a high school memorization test into such top posts is obviously stupid, yet it happens all the time in Japan. It obviously explains why so many of the bureaucrats lack vision, are so insular-minded, and have the creativity of newts, but at least they are intelligent. The education system filters well for intelligence, but that is not enough for today's fast-changing world, where creativity and vision are increasingly needed. Company personnel department staffs should drop their quota system, for example, X% of recruits from Tokyo University, etc. With a GRE system in Japan and graduate and postgraduate grades, personnel managers can judge by the grades and not the names of the universities. Hence, the university in which one does one's undergraduate work becomes less important, because it's the grade that counts, not where one got it from. So it would not be so important which university one got into, so long as during the university years one got good grades. Hence the pressure would be taken off the secondary school students to get into a good university, etc. This logic then applies all the way down to kindergarten, so that the juku business can die and Japanese kids can have a life without having to waste their childhood cramming useless knowledge that they will forget immediately after the entrance exams. Maybe then the Japanese education system can do what education is supposed to do, namely to teach its students to think logically and to create, rather than only to passively memorize. This would lead to more flexibility in one's career. For example, in the US now, the average company employee changes his job every 5 years. This flexibility is seen as an asset in an era of rapid technological change. Technology is creating and destroying jobs faster and faster. One of the reasons why Japan has been doing poorly in economic terms in the 1990s is that Japanese society is not geared for rapid, creative technological innovation. America's been pulling ahead lately, although the Japanese high-tech multinationals very recently have been doing extremely well, which is good for me. Japan desperately needs to reform its education system to foster creativity and individualism, otherwise it will never be number one. Actually, this is only partly true. There's another way the Japanese can become number one, and that is to import the best brains in the world to Japan, to invest in the new sciences, to create the new technologies, to generate a new economy. Rabbit hutches, war, guilt. When I'm in the train looking out at Japan's suburban housing, I'm struck how inferior it is by Western standards. It's truly third world, yet Japan is a rich country. Why the discrepancy? Admittedly, there's a shortage of land, but still, why does Japan insist on growing its own rice at a customer price, which is several times more expensive than the world price? If Japan imported its rice, it would have a lot more land for housing, so the price for land would drop substantially. If one includes the price of land when calculating living standards in international comparisons, then Japan is a mediocre country in the middle of the industrialized nations, about 20th or so. With lower land prices, Japanese homeowners would have more money left over to build better houses. So why does Japan insist on growing its own rice? Many other countries import their food, so why not Japan? Why do the Japanese significantly lower their material standard of living by dwelling in rabbit hutches? This third world housing standard results from the impact on land prices of their decision not to import rice. I think the deep answer to this fundamental question is again Japanese insularity. It's well known that Japan's overseas neighbours still hate the Japanese, particularly the older generation. I travel regularly to continental Asia and know firsthand how deeply the Japanese are hated because of the atrocities they committed in World War II and their colonial policies in Korea and China. This hatred lingers despite the fact that it's been 50 years since the Japanese murdered 30 million Asians, one of history's greatest crimes in terms of sheer numbers of people killed. The wounds are very deep, particularly in China, where 20 million Chinese were murdered by the invading Japanese army. Unfortunately, the Japanese still have not truly atoned to their Asian neighbours for these massive crimes. The invaded Asian nations know this, and they also know that the younger Japanese have not been told by the Japanese Education Ministry what happened. Asian governments, on the other hand, certainly inform their peoples of what the Japanese did. My God, in China, you can't get away from it. Chinese TV and films are full of it. I know, I go to China regularly, but in Japan, school textbooks have been regularly censored to keep Japanese schoolchildren ignorant of what their grandparents did in the war. In Japan's semi-democracy, the bureaucrats did not want their role, nor the Japanese emperor's role in the war criticized by a critically informed public. Since they had control of the content of the textbooks, they censored them as they pleased. The Chinese and Koreans, etc., bitterly resented this. They cannot accept that the memory of the massive suffering they were subjected to under the Japanese be simply obliterated from young Japanese minds. Even today, the Japanese are having great difficulty in accepting the fact that some 200,000 young continental Asian women were conscripted in the war to serve as sex slaves, unpaid prostitutes, for Japanese soldiers. In Japan, these women are euphemistically called comfort women in the Japanese language press. In general, there's not the same degree of shame in the Japanese public for the Japanese atrocities of World War II as there is in Germany. When a German neo-Nazi group gets in the news, for example by burning down a Turkish guest worker dormitory, or when some deluded neo-Nazi thug says that Auschwitz never happened. My second wife's mother was gassed by the Germans at Auschwitz. The German government will put Holocaust movies on primetime TV to educate the public. Lately, it's now against German law to make such statements. It's interesting, this ad-libbing now. This, I read this, 10 years ago? No, 20 years ago. God, 20 years ago. I've done a complete U-turn. There was no gassing at Auschwitz. We know that thanks to Gorbachev. He opened up the Russian archives in the late 80s. Researchers went in, they found all the death certificates of the prisoners who had died in those World War II years, and there weren't millions of them. There were 70,000. 40,000 of them were Jews, and being death certificates, the German doctors wrote down the cause of death. No mention of gassing. Most of them died of starvation and typhus, and that was because Towards the end of the war, the last months, the Luftwaffe had been shot out of the sky by the Allies, and so the Allies were then just mopping up, destroying the infrastructure of Germany in the last months. So the food trains could not get through to the concentration camps into Western Poland, and so the prisoners there just starved. And when you're starving, your immune system goes down, and so they got typhus and just died in large numbers. So indirectly you can blame the Allies for these deaths, but there was no gassing. I mean, God, they had swimming, Auschwitz had swimming pools and orchestras and soccer teams and so forth. So the idea of the Holocaust with a capital H was really concocted in the 70s by the Jews themselves, the Jewish elite, to make it easier for them to extract so-called guilt money in favour to prop up a bankrupting Israel. So yet another example of the abuse of the Jewish elite, of the stupid goy. So you can see I've done a complete U-turn. I know because I speak German and had German TV in Brussels when I was living there, plus TV from the UK, France, Holland, Belgium, Italy, Spain, Luxembourg, etc. Oh, how I miss the cosmopolitan life of Europe. But living anywhere is a compromise. I doubt whether I could tolerate European scientific conservatism and the lack of research funding in a region with double-digit unemployment, having lived in Japan. Nothing like this ever happens in Japan. You mention Auschwitz to a German and he'll hang his head in shame. Well, that's what I thought 20 years ago. You mention the rape of Nanking to a Japanese and he'll probably not have heard of the place. There are even Japanese politicians who say it never really happened or was wildly exaggerated. Regularly, the Koreans, Chinese, Singaporeans, etc. are outraged by statements coming from Japanese politicians concerning World War II events. Japanese children are taught a lot of Japanese history, except for the period of the 1930s and 1940s. I believe that relations between Japan and its neighbours will not improve much until the Japanese population is taught about its atrocities in the war, so that the Japanese population can feel ashamed and then make that shame visible to their Asian neighbours. If the continental Asians can see that the Japanese population is genuinely ashamed of what it did, the way the Germans are ashamed, then the Asians will soften their hatred towards the Japanese. But that hasn't happened yet. No Japanese wants to educate the public in such a way. For example, there's been no Japanese movie director who has made movies of Japan's atrocities from the continental Asian perspective. Doing such a thing would be felt by the Japanese to be traitorous, tarnishing the reputation of the Japanese people. The Japanese are too insular and nationalistic to even contemplate such a thing. I believe the only way the Japanese will be taught about their atrocities will be by having non-Japanese TV documentaries and movies come into Japan from other countries via global satellite TV. If such Japanese movie directors existed, their work would be considered too disturbing to Japanese wa. I've had Japanese so-called feminist journalists say to me that they could not possibly publish my masculine criticisms of fluffies in the national newspapers because it would disturb the wa, the harmony. They say that most of Japan's women are fluffies, that is, they are dependent financially on men. Such a criticism would disturb millions of people. Such conservative reasoning, I believe, partly explains Japan's ignorance of its own wartime atrocities. It's not acceptable in Japan to make Japan look poor in the eyes of Japanese. It's the tatamai hone distinction, so strong in Japan. The tatamai is the surface diplomatic lie, and the hone is the underlying reality. That is what a person really thinks privately, but doesn't express publicly. The Japanese are so insular that they don't care or not even aware of what their neighbours think about them. I hope, now that global TV is coming, the Japanese will be exposed to satellite TV documentaries on this issue, hopefully in English, or even better, in Japanese, made by their Asian neighbours. Then maybe the long overdue Japanese guilt will start to grow, and relations between Japan and its neighbours can improve. At the moment, Japan has no friends. No other country particularly likes the Japanese or trusts them. The Japanese only have themselves to blame. Relations between Japan and its neighbours are so bad that the Japanese prefer to grow their own rice, so at least they won't starve if China or anyone else imposes a naval blockade on the shipping lanes, making food rice imports impossible. The Japanese pay a high price, literally, for their incredible insularity, both in terms of material standard of living, so land prices and their third world housing, but also in terms of the mistrust of their neighbours. This is so stupid. In my mind, the Japanese are simply interculturally incompetent and have a lot to learn about the rest of the world beyond the conceptual horizons of Japan's little island. Minorities. Japan has a poor international reputation for its treatment of its minorities. The worst treatment occurs with the so-called burakumin, or ETA, ETA. Japan's untouchable class, of which there are about 3 million. Historically, they were the butchers and leather craftsmen, trades that were considered unclean by Buddhist doctrine, Buddhism coming from cow-fetished India. If you are an ETA and you hide the fact, you could today be fired on the spot from a major company if you are found out. I've read accounts where young wives who are happily married with a baby have divorced their ETA husbands in shame on discovering their husbands' real identities. Detectives are hired to see if a potential marriage partner has any ETA ancestry. The irony of this outrageous discrimination is that the ETA are of the same genetic stock as ordinary Japanese. You cannot tell the difference between an ETA and clean Japanese. This blatant and cruel discrimination dismisses Japan, in the eyes of Westerners, from any chance of belonging to that exclusive club of civilized nations. There's more. From 1910 to Japan's defeat in 1945, Korea was a Japanese colony. Koreans were not allowed to speak Korean in the Japanese-controlled schools, and they hated the Japanese for it. Even today, 50 years later, the Korean hatred for the Japanese is so strong that it's against Korean law to import popular Japanese culture in the form of CDs, video, etc. In the colonial period, Koreans were transported to Japan as forced labourers. Today, there are about 700,000 Koreans living in Japan, most of them second and third generation, but they are denied Japanese citizenship. They are treated as foreigners. Japan is a very closed society. It has a very strong them and us mentality due to its cultural homogeneity and its geographical isolation. Pluralism is a foreign concept to the Japanese. The irony is that Japan should feel highly indebted to its Koreans because in a certain common sense way, Japanese are Koreans. I discovered this nearly a decade ago at a neural net conference in California at a reception. Some Japanese-looking conference attendees approached me and I spoke to them in Japanese. Nihonjin desu ka? Are you Japanese? In Japanese language. No, they said, deeply offended. We're Korean. I learned two things. One, Koreans don't like Japanese. And two, I can't tell the difference between them. Their genetic characteristics are the same. Well, I'm in Korea. When I'm in Korea, I feel I'm in Japan, except that the clock is set back about 15 years, economically and politically speaking. Common sense says that Homo sapiens, the species, did not originate on an offshore island. The Japanese population had to come from somewhere. The archaeologists say that roughly 2,000 years ago, the last major wave of Korean immigration to Japan took place, about 1 million people ad-libbing. That's because at that time, about 2,000 years ago, there was a war going on in northeast China, and about 1 million Koreans fled for their lives to Japan in a kind of boat people incident. Back to the book. The Koreans brought their customs and values with them, which became Japanese customs. Even Japan's Shinto religion, which the insular-minded Japanese like to think of as their own, originated in Korea. I have a book written by 2 American scholars who investigate the Japanese cultural debt to Korea, which asserts this. This book I bought in Korea. Later, it was via the Koreans that the Japanese civilized themselves by importing Chinese culture, Buddhism, Confucianism, Chinese characters, Chinese governmental ideas, etc. Over a millennium ago, the Japanese had great respect for the Chinese and Koreans, which at the time were clearly superior cultures. So genetically speaking, Japanese are largely Koreans, with possibly some South Sea Islander genes and others. There's a strong suspicion among Western scholars who study Japanese history that the first emperors in Japan's long line of emperors were actually Koreans, and that the reason why these scholars are banned from examining these emperors' tombs is that they might find evidence to support this hypothesis. I have a book called Multicultural Japan, edited by Donald Denoon, D-E-N-O-N et al., 1996, Cambridge University Press, which says, page 4, quote, "The second wave of immigrants came from Northeast Asia, most likely via the Korean Peninsula. This migration continued for over a millennium through what are known as the Yaoyoi and Kofun periods. That's about 4000 BC to AD 700. And by the latter Kofun period, there seems to have been considerable mixing of indigenous and immigrant groups as far as southern Tohoku. About 1 million people left the continent in some boat people saga, whose causes are only dimly understood." Ad-libbing now. My current Chinese wife is, or was she retired, a professor of ancient Chinese literature, so she knows a lot of ancient Chinese history, and she tells me categorically that if you go back far enough into Chinese history, you learn that Koreans are Chinese. To settle the archipelago, until eventually the original Jomon peoples were outnumbered, perhaps by as much as 10 to 1, according to Hanihara Kazuro. The migrants brought wet rice agriculture and bronze and iron technology. They settled northern Kyushu and western Honshu, either merging with and absorbing the original Jomon inhabitants or confining them to culturally distinctive formations in the peripheral regions of Hokkaido and northern Honshu. By the 7th century, these Northeast Asian immigrants and their descendants constituted between 70% and 90% of the population of the islands, which might by then have amounted to 5 or 6 million people, and constructed a distinctive political and cultural order centering on the court, which emerged in the Kinai region or in the vicinity of present-day Osaka and Kyoto. The book also says, page 6, quote, "Even in the 1990s, the long hand of control over the past is exercised in the form of a ban enforced by the Imperial Household Agency over any excavation of 158 major tomb sites thought to contain the remains of imperial ancestors, one purpose of which is to limit the risk of embarrassing archaeological discoveries, particularly any which might throw light on the origins of the imperial family." In other words, the first emperors in Japan were Koreans. What an insult to the Koreans! How intellectually and scientifically dishonest, and how contemptible as judged by Westerners. If the world, and particularly the Western world, hears about this, there will be an outrage against Japan. I wondered how much the Koreans know about this, so I asked a Korean friend of mine. He said, well, most Koreans know that the ancient emperors in Japan were from Korea, and at least the ancient scholars and technicians were from Korea. I mentioned this strong suspicion to a Japanese good friend of mine, that is, that Japanese are genetically Koreans, and that the first